Hey yo, welcome to Self-Made Dad. I'm feeling pumped. One of the things that I wanted to talk about today has to do with something that happened to me earlier this week over the weekend. You might have seen in my stories that I was working with my daughter on reading a difficult word. The word was tiramisu, and she ended up crying because she couldn't sound it out. I felt some kind of way about that. And I wanted to unpack that a little bit. When is too hard to push your kids? When have you gone too far? How can you know when you've gone too far? And frankly, why do we push our kids so hard? Let's unpack that a little bit. I mentioned she was crying because she had a hard time reading this word. For full context, she wanted to have some sweets. We were having tiramisu as a farewell gift to my mom because she left. I was like, all right, cool. If you want to have some, you got to be able to read the word. I worked with her. We started sounding it out. But obviously, it's a word that's complicated and she hasn't really seen it before. In reality, it was a tough word for her. But I kept pushing and I was like, look, we can do hard things. We don't give up. Try again. Take it small bit by bit. All of the things that I felt like were productive things to push my kid to do and to try. So I was doing that, but she started crying. And the first thought that I had was, man, you're being a chump right now. Now, what kind of a dad does that, right? Like, what kind of a dad is like, man, my kid's being a chump with this reading situation? Well, I'm here to say that that was me this time. And I really asked myself, why am I pushing her so hard on this? Candidly, with reading in particular, my daughter has had seasons with it. She's been great at reading, then she's regressed. And then she's been great at reading and she regressed. It's like following this interest pattern that she has, but I'm realizing it's also a function of the friends that she has around her at school. And, when she's not in school for a long period of time, and she's with me and with the family, she's reading more. But then when she's at school, she gets into her art projects and her coloring projects and a lot of other things that aren't reading or math. And it just takes her off track. At least in my perception, takes her off track. And that's ultimately what I wanted to dig into, which is why does this matter? What is the track? I want her to be able to read and do math well. The first things that I tell myself when I'm why am I pushing her so hard is because I want her to get good grades, right? She took her first ever test at the beginning of the school year this year. She did okay. It was her first time taking a test. We never let her use a computer, and reading the instructions, then acting on them in itself was an exercise that she struggled with because she goes through ebbs and flows with reading. I was not pleased with the results. And I was like, all right, we got to dig in and get better at this. I know you can do it. So I've been pushing. Naturally, I want her to get good grades, because good grades turn into her getting accolades and awards, which turn into recognition, which turns into college acceptance, which turns into scholarships, hopefully, which turns into. At least that's what I'm telling myself, right? I'm I'm going to push her because if she gets good at this stuff, then she'll have opportunities. And when I broke it down, it was really I think I'm trying to say that I want her to get good grades and learn how to do things so that she knows how to develop skills and can become skilled at something, which leads to money, which leads to independence and success. And I'm doing air quotes for success, right? And that is one part of this. But then I realized and unpacked the big part of this is really just I want her to be good at reading and math because I was really good at reading and math at that age, at least in my memory. As I pulled on the thread and I see a comment in the chat about putting your own standards on your kids, right? That is what I was doing, trying to fit my own ego and expectations from that ego on top of my kid, which was unfair to her because she's her own person, right? I said she has seasons with reading. She's working on arts and crafts and building things right now. And earlier I said she's off track, which is ridiculous because maybe she doesn't read perfectly like I want her to right now, or maybe she doesn't do math perfectly the way I want her to do right now. But guess what? She has the most clear, specific, and complex visions for properties and building cities and communities. And she will tell you exact details of visions that she has and will start making them. We've made airplanes out of her vision. We've built towns and communities with physical things out of her vision. Right now, she's working on building a stadium because she wants to do cheerleading. So she's like, well, you can't do cheerleading without a stadium. It needs to be in a big stadium. So we have like a whole design that she's drawing up, and we're going to go get cardboard and like cut the cardboard and set up stanchions and seating and a stage and all this stuff in a, I think it's like a 6x6 space. But like, that's what she's doing. And you know what I wasn't doing at her age? That. I was reading books, but I was not doing that. I was not creating things. It's taken me some self-reflection to appreciate the fact that she is her own person, number one, and the way that she's going to progress her development in the context of this like school learning industrial complex is going to be different than mine. And I have to adjust to that. But I have to take my ego and my own traumas out of it. I did a poll at the beginning of this week about signs and signals that you're pushing your kid too hard. And some of the feedback I got from people was that they consistently are treating their own kids from a place of ego and trauma themselves, right? It's a common theme. We want the best for our kids, right? Like that's what we want. But how we sometimes motivate ourselves to motivate them comes from a place of self. It comes from a place of trauma that we carry. It's unresolved, and we're using our kids as a conduit or maybe a replacement for us to deal with these things or boost our own egos in ways that we should be doing on our own, independent of our kids. And we should put that stuff to the side so that we can focus on developing these kids into the best person they can be. And I see a comment, that one person's kid is an engineer at heart and he's trying to nurture that. And like, that's what I'm talking about, right? Like, you have to see the person for who they are, even if they're not like you. That pivot, that twist is the hard part of this, right? They're not like you. A lot of us like to think that our kids are mini us. Even parents and grandparents will talk in that language. Oh, you have a little you. Oh, look at the little junior. Oh, look at the little, baby girl just like you. She does that just like me, just like you. When we were naming our kids, I was very, very against the junior naming structure. And no disrespect to anybody who has done a second or a third or whatever. But for me, I was like, look, I want to make sure that I and the world are clear that this person is their own person. And that's easy to do when you're naming a kid, but then like, acting in it is tough, right? Here's some things I wrote down as like things that came up for me as I recognized that I was placing my own ego onto my kid and trying to raise her from a place of self-satisfaction instead of developing her. I've been using language lately that I want her to have something she's worked on for 10 years. That's come from a place of me feeling like when I was a kid, I didn't have a thing that I focused on and I was like consistent with. There's this like envy I have for people who played basketball throughout their whole childhood or who were on like debate team and Model UN from like fourth grade until they graduated high school or something like that. I was like, man, I wish I stuck with something that long. There's some narrative I've told myself that, it's important to stick with a thing. All opportunities are off the table if you don't, which by the way, if I believe that, and I am where I am right now, then that is proof positive that narrative isn't true. I feel like I've done pretty well for myself in my life. And now I'm in a place where despite, quote unquote, me not focusing early in life, I have done pretty well. So stop it, internal narrative. And then number two, actually, like I had focused on a few things for a number of years. I have consistently been like a community people leader and organizer. Like I've just put people together into teams and like organized and led them. And that was very true and clear in the other thing that I focused on for about 10 years, which was like my Boy Scout career. Like I was a Boy Scout, I think from second grade until I graduated high school. I was patrol leader for the majority of that. I was troop leader for a year for that. I just naturally organized people into doing things. And I'll be honest, the first half of that, I was organizing people into nonsense and into like getting into trouble. But I was leading, and that's what I'm saying. Like, I was doing things for 10 years already. So I'm ignoring the things that I already did because I've told myself some story that is discounting the track record I've already had. And I'm bringing that baggage to my kid. Another example of this is like, and this takes on different framings. I'm going to use like a male framing because it's the one I can hear it through. It's like, why you need to man up? Like, you need to be tough like me. Or you may have heard, for those of you in fraternities or organizations like that, when people will say like, oh, well, back in my day, we pledged harder. We went harder. It was way tougher for us. Like, y'all didn't go through it as hard. Or I'm trying to make this hard on you because it was hard on me. And that's a form of trauma transfer, if we're being honest, right? Like, that's unfair for me to hold the standard of some societal difficulty over my kid when, frankly, my parents or I am doing all this work so that they don't have to live life as hard as me. Right? Like that's kind of the point. You don't think that like the second generation Vanderbilts were given a hard time for not having it as hard when their parents built multi-generational unspendable wealth. Like sure, they're probably like, I wish you grew up with a little bit of a harder time so that you understand these values, but like I don't think that they would trade positions of like poverty. It's ridiculous. Applying that like you need to have it hard because I had it hard, or that I need to make it hard on you because the world is going to be hard on you, is a form of transferring trauma onto your kid. It's coming from a place of trauma, and that's unfair, right? So I'm bringing all this up because this is like soil in which a lot of parents, and I'll speak specifically to fathers, a lot of fathers plant the seeds that they grow their fatherhood approach from. And if you plant that soil into I need to make this about me so that I can solve some problem that I had that was either true or not true, but I'm holding as baggage, or I'm going to transfer some trauma onto you because I've come up with some justification and rationalization for why you need to experience it also, negates the ability of the kid to have an independent identity, right? When you think about developing an athlete, right? And I've been an endurance athlete for, I don't know, 13 years. I think a lot about how I train myself, and when I coach new people to cycling or to triathlons, how do I talk to them? And it always starts with understanding what they have. Like, who are you as an athlete? Are you a sprinter, a long endurance person? Do you have interval strength that's long, but like maybe not long conditioning? We have to talk through this and have to see it, because once we understand the type of athlete you are, then we can strategize the training and the race approach based on your strengths. But we a lot of times forget to do that with our kids. And dads will be like, man, I'm just here to make it hard. I'm going to make it tough. I'm going to push because that is the way that you become a better person, right? Like that's how we were raised in a lot of instances as boys in society. But then we lose the opportunity to develop the strengths that our kids are showing us they have, right? These kids are showing us early who they are, right? Like my daughter, like I mentioned, has vision. She has like these ideas for community, for structures, for organizations, and she is a natural leader. Every single teacher that she has had has been like, she is a natural born leader. She organizes people, she has them do things, she takes on responsibility, and she helps negotiate with kids who are having issues. And she's like very assertive and communicative and clear. Like she's got leadership traits at her core. And so it's like, why am I worrying about some of this stuff, right? Because of my own stuff. And that's kind of the point, right? Get yourself out of the equation, get your ego out of the equation, and look at the kid for who they are and train them to those skills. That's important. So why do we do this, right? Like, why do we make it about us? What's the use of that? Well, a lot of it's subconscious, if I'm being honest. I think like number one, it's easy to like work out our traumas with kids, right? And like work out our ego stuff with kids, because kids listen to us. It's like, you are the parent. Who is the kid going to listen to? Most of the time when they're young, they're going to listen to and follow the instructions of the parent. So then if you wish you had been an elite quarterback or a really awesome striker or scorer in soccer, or you wish you had made the debate team, and you start pushing your kid to do that despite them not showing the capacity for that, you are seeking validation of your own desires through them. And in some cases, like the kid may be set up for success with that, right? Like they may be athletically or intelligence gifted to the point where they can do that. But in a lot of cases, they're not. And you're just pushing them and setting them up for failure, because you want to be validated with that. If you had been the head quarterback, the first string quarterback, you could have been popular, gotten attention, gotten the date, been homecoming king or queen, whatever. But that's not what they need. The kids need their own thing. But like we're like working out our stuff on them, right? It's also like very validating to put people through the same trauma or hurdles that we have been through, right? I experienced this with corporate life. And so I'm going to use that as a metaphor, but like hopefully it'll be clear. When I was, I don't know, like late 20s, I applied to business school because that's what everybody did, right? You go through banking, you go to private equity, you go to business school, you go back, and then, whatever, you make all the money. But I've historically and continually want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be independent. I want to be self-sufficient. Everything I studied about entrepreneurship didn't say go to business school. It said start a business. But I would talk to all these people who were a little bit older than me, and they went to business school and they were like, listen, like, you got to go to business school. Here are all the reasons. And they would push it to the point where they would implement or they would impart guilt on me or fear in me that if I didn't go to business school, I would lose something. I would lose out on opportunities. I would lose out on brand. I would be less than. But when I stepped back and I looked at what it took to be an entrepreneur, it wasn't some piece of paper. It was the tolerance to take risk, the initiative to get started, and frankly, like just resilience. Like you just got to start. You just got to start and you got to keep going. Every time you get knocked down, you got to get up. And so cool, like having an MBA or having a credential could help, but it doesn't accelerate in the same way those core traits do. So I was like, let me go do that. And guess what? It worked out. And plenty of other entrepreneurs I know it's worked out for. Those people were trying to validate their path. They chose to go to business school, and therefore everybody should choose to go to business school because that's their decision. And you know what? Those people were telling me that they couldn't become entrepreneurs because they had school debt they had to pay off and all these other obligations that were created because they went to business school. So in effect, they were telling me to not pursue my dream in order to validate their decisions on their life path, which is fundamentally absurd. So when you look at how you parent your kid, if you are pushing them to work out until failure, go be like figure things out by themselves without help for into perpetuity. If you're pushing them to fall down on the bike 6 times and scrape their knee without any guidance or support or training wheels, then you are fundamentally trying to reinforce something that you went through and make your ego feel better about experiencing that instead of looking at the best way, the most effective way to help this kid become better at what they're doing and then adjust your approach as such. That's the fundamental thing that anybody getting better at a thing needs. But we as parents often reference like what we have experienced and use that as the ultimate like reference point and standard. And then decide, hey, you know what? I'm going to do it this way because that's how the world has taught me that it's supposed to go. So even though it's hard, even though it might create trauma for the kid, even though it might make them feel unattended, even if it makes them feel like they aren't seen and when they ask for help, they won't get it, I'm going to do it this way because that makes me feel like my experience was valid and necessary. And that's hard to ignore because like parents, like, I mean, look, people generally like don't want to feel like the things that they decided or the experiences they had were unnecessary or wrong. Like that's just unfair. And so we do stuff like this. We validate our experiences by imparting them to our kids in ways that may be counterproductive. It's so much easier to like just kind of validate it by making your kid go through it than going to therapy or having a journal and then reflecting on what you went through, unpacking that, healing it, and then coming back to coaching and parenting your kid from a place of egoless, centered perspective or free of baggage, right? It's so much easier to just be like, you know what? It was hard for me, so it's going to be hard for you. That's easy. Because then the kid goes through it, and because kids are resilient, they survive. And then you're like, see, I made you stronger. But then at the end of it, they might snap, right? They might not like the thing anymore. They might walk away from a passion that they had because they got pushed in a way that was counterproductive to the way they need to be motivated. And that's ultimately like what matters here is recognizing when our egos are getting in the way of what our kids need, like what they need to develop. Oh yeah, and like Mark is making this point, like if you don't pay attention to this and deal with your baggage, like your kids can grow up to resent you. And like I wrote this for my Instagram caption today. I'm hoping that the work that I'm doing on myself now as a parent, and I'm encouraging you all to do, will keep my kids out of the therapy chair to complain about like my approach. And not to say that I want them to complain about my wife's approach. And also not to say that they're not going to have complaints because I'm going to mess something up. But like, man, I'm trying to work on the stuff I can control. I don't want them growing up resenting me because I was pushing them in ways that were unaware of what they need. I'll even speak for myself, man. Like, as I've watched my mother grandparent and effectively reparent through my kids, I have observed that she typically doesn't like acknowledge the emotional state of the kid. So like my daughter will be frustrated about something. Like as an example, maybe it's that my mom, her grandmother, is paying a lot of attention to the baby, but not any attention to her. And in my mom's mind, she associates with like, oh, I take her out once a week to go to like get food and do this stuff with I'm giving her attention. But she's not acknowledging the fact that like all of the little doting and baby talk and like cuddling she does with the baby is seen by my daughter as not loving her. So I talked to her about it, and my mom's just like, ah, whatever. And she just ignores it. And I know that frustrates my daughter. And it brought up to me a point where, like, it helped me recognize that I get really frustrated about feeling unseen because that was part of my childhood. And so, like, as I see how that affects my kid, I see the opportunities for engaging with my daughter in ways that will help her address the things that she's feeling sensitive to. That's ultimately like a big part of our job as parents, to step back, get out of our own egos, and then see what our kids need. But like a lot of people don't do that because they don't know how. So here are some suggestions, right? This is what works for me. I think number one is just slowing down. The world is super fast. Time passes by fast. I made this whole point about it on my last live. Time flies, but we need to slow down and like look at what's going on with our kid. I sometimes scroll back to old photos and videos of my kid from a year to 3 years ago to remind myself how far she's come, and also try to identify who she was that she was showing me early on. And as I've done that, as I've just taken time to reflect and review, I've noticed like some of her personality traits from when she was 2 are still present. Like I didn't have any real like influence over them. She just was this way. That has been amazing and just like eye-opening for me. But it's also helped me adjust my parenting style, right? As an example, like my daughter has always been emotionally sensitive. And I don't just mean like, oh, she cries really easily. I mean that she is very aware. She is able to sense what's going on with people. And she carries that energy with her in certain ways. So she knows like if I'm sick, she can sense it. And she can sense the difference between me being sick and me being stressed. And she adjusts herself accordingly. She makes herself bigger or smaller, or she's more helpful or more withdrawn, depending on what she feels like I need. And so that has demanded of me as a parent to be communicative with her. So I will communicate with her, hey, I'm feeling stressed out about whatever, and I see you doing this, and I want you to know I appreciate that. Or you don't need to do that. I can take care of me. I want you to take care of you. Go do this and take care of you, right? It's just helped me to be aware of like what she does naturally, so that I can see how she adjusts when something's going on with me or me and my wife or my wife, then coach her through that so she doesn't feel like she only has to present herself in a certain way in certain situations. And look, that's not easy, right? Like that takes effort. But look, damn it, my kids are worth it. So I'm going to put up the effort. I hope you put up the effort because I hope you see that your kids are worth it, man. These are the future. So that's like one thing. Just slow down, reflect, right? The other thing I would say is like, just ask yourself why this matters to you, right? Like going back to this reading the tiramisu situation, right? I was like asking myself, why does it matter to me that my kid is tough, right? That she doesn't give up, that she doesn't quit. I will tell you my thinking through this, it's like 50-50 rational and irrational. The rational part of me is that as I've seen my daughter, I notice that she will stop trying when she hits a wall with something. And this isn't abnormal. Like kids do this. They're like, oh, this seems too hard. And it's usually like one little effort before she could actually figure a thing out. Like, oh, I can't open this bottle, or oh, I don't know how to say this word, or oh, I can't figure out this math. And it's like, if she just tries one more time, she'll figure it out. And I've seen her do it a bunch of times where I'll ask her, I'll be like, hey, what would you do as a next attempt with this thing? And she'll be like, oh, I would try this. And I'm like, okay, try it. And then she does it. And then she figures it out and she's super excited. And I'm like, great. See, you could figure these things out for yourself. I've actually tried to implement the mantra with her of when she gets frustrated and stuck on something that she tells herself, I'm going to try it one more time. That's the mantra I'm trying to build into her right now, just because I see that that is a need for her. But the irrational part of me is like, man, I don't want her to be weak. I don't want her to be out here quitting just because she's quitting. And like, that's such a weak trait. And like, I don't want that in my kid. Like, I don't do that. So I don't want my kid to do that. And that is the part where Brian's ego comes into play, right? My lived experiences need to be validated by seeing my daughter do it and go through it. And that's where it's unfair, right? Like, I do believe resilience is important and needs to be conditioned into kids, right? But some of that can come from different places. The first time I got an F was on a geography test. And candidly, like, I am terrible at geography. I know I have all like followers and listeners from literally all over the world now. I cannot find your country on a map. I can't find the states on a map in the United States, and I've lived here my entire life. So I failed. It's fine. But I got that F. That was like my first F in life. It was in 3rd grade. Mrs. Woodward's class. And I was like, "Oh, I can't do this. This isn't cool." And I put my head down and studied so hard to get an A the next time around. But I had to experience that failure, and it taught me at least a little, it put a brick in the foundation of how to be resilient. Like, experience loss, then how do you rebound? How do you keep going? How do you keep trying? And, like, I would say, like, another example of that was when I was learning how to wrestle in high school. Like, I came to it late. I was just trying to figure out, like, how to get myself conditioned, how to get stronger at this. And honestly, like, my first year on the team, I just got my butt kicked consistently. I got my butt kicked on the mat every single practice. I had to figure out how to keep trying, how to put in the extra work and push through the fear and pain and embarrassment of, like, getting my butt kicked every single time on the mat. And, eventually, like, I got better. And, the pinnacle of my wrestling career was, like, I placed 5th at state. Like, hooray. Which is great. But, like, I'm reminding myself in this moment that these opportunities aren't binary, right? This isn't the only time I will have to teach my daughter how to be resilient. And so, like, pushing her to push through this one thing isn't the end of the world if she can't do it, right? But that's the irrational ego part of myself. And you can see very clearly in how I illustrate this that this can very easily be circling in all of our brains at the same time. And, like, it's not cool to put your own ego on the kid because, then I made my kid cry. And, like, I don't want to be that kind of dad. And I hope that y'all don't want to be that kind of dad. But it's easy to be that kind of dad. So just ask yourself, like, what's really going on with you and why is it so important that you're pushing this hard? And then I think the last thing is just, like, candidly, I got this from some of the responses in the poll in my Instagram stories, but you just got to follow the fun, right? Is this fun? And so going back to, like, my own childhood, like, I know I put my energy into things that I thought were really fun. And then when I was struggling with things like geography, I ended up having to figure out ways to make it fun so that I could study and get through it and get better grades. But I ultimately had to create a environment of fun around it. And that might mean, like, changing up the format. So instead of reading it, I was watching Discovery Channel to learn the thing, or a documentary. Or it might be, instead of me studying by myself or trying this thing by myself, I'd do it with a friend. But I always had to follow that fun. Kids and people, right? Like, we think about this as adults, like, we learn differently. We've got Myers-Briggs, we've got Enneagrams, we've got MBTI. There's, like, all these different modules to tell us how different we are. And then optimize our, like, life and situation for those differences. We just got to remember that, like, kids are the same way, man. And so as parents, again, you got to look at the kid and then say, hey, I understand how you are. You are this type of way. You like these kind of things. You respond well to you respond to pressure in this way. You don't respond to pressure in that way. You don't like when I pressure you. You like when mom pressures you, and then adjust your approach accordingly. Because if you're so worried about your kid doing the thing because you asked them to do it, instead of your kid doing it because, like, just doing it and, like, being successful at it, that's your ego operating instead of your desire for the kid to be productive and to have growth and to become better, right? If you need the kid to do it and, like, execute it because you asked for it, then you are failing their kid because you are putting your ego over their needs. So follow the fun and see how you can navigate them into situations where they'll learn and do the thing in a way that will continue to create positive momentum for them and help them desire to keep doing the thing. Like, I'll close with this. The story I was thinking of, and I think I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, is, like, the kid who has played basketball their entire childhood. I always wanted to be that kid, right? When you think about elite athletes, right? All the pro NBA or NFL players I've had the luxury to know at some point have some story of their upbringing where they just said, like, I picked up a basketball at two or whatever, and I just, like, really enjoyed it, and I just kept playing, and I kept bouncing the ball and shooting it and doing whatever, and I kept playing it. And I went to the court and I kept playing it, and I had fun, and I kept playing it. And, there are also stories of trauma, right? Like, and these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. There are some kids who loved playing basketball because their home life was so stressful or so impoverished that was the only place they felt control or safe or they could escape. But they're not mutually exclusive, and, like, they still followed that fun so much so that they became elite at it to become the single percent person who was able to make it to the league of whatever their sport is. They rarely talk about their parents pushing them hard, forcing them to do things, making them work on something until they threw up or whatever. That might be a coach at some point, but that's never the parent. They usually talk about their parents being there, encouraging them, and they talk about their parents reminding them that there is something in this that they enjoy and to find that even in the hard moments. That's the kind of parent I'm aspiring to be. That's the kind of dad I want to be, and which is why I'm looking at this specific topic for myself. And I hope that's the kind of dad you can be. So that's it. Thanks for listening. I was really feeling some kind of way about that situation, and this was therapeutic for me and hopefully helpful for you. So thanks for joining.